There is a weird thing that happened with Doctor Zhivago. Abroad, in the Western countries, this novel by Boris Pasternak is treated as the key Russian novel of the 20th century. My guess would be if we were to pull Russians on these questions, the Master and Margarita would easily take over, or even something like Quiet Flows the Dawn, or even something by the Soviet authors might just get ahead. There are some answers as to why that is, why so few Russians have actually read the novel, and why it might be more popular abroad, so let's explore them. Boris Pasternak, one of the 5 Russian/Soviet authors who have ever been awarded the Nobel Prize, was both a Soviet writer and not. He was born in 1890 here in Moscow in a Jewish family, but more importantly in an artistic family. The father, Leonid, was a talented painter. These are some of his pieces. I especially like this one, although I have to censor it for YouTube. And the mother, Rosalia, was a pianist. Boris dabbled in both of these art forms. He even had aspirations of following in his mother's footsteps. He was highly praised by a composer Scriabin. There are even a few pieces of music written by Pasternak still, but obviously literature took over. But both of these art forms Pasternak manages to incorporate into his poems. He was a good student, attended the Moscow Gymnasium and Moscow State University, first studying law, then switching to philosophy and history, I think. Since the family could afford it, they sent Pasternak to study philosophy to the Mecca of philosophy, which was Germany at the time, so he spent some time at the Marburg University. This was the time of his first heartbreak. He'd fallen madly in love with Ida Vysotskaya, but was rejected. It even led to him abandoning philosophy altogether, as this tragedy was so great for him. But at the same time, this rejection might have pushed him away from philosophy, but pushed him towards poetry, as only poems can actually express the overwhelming emotions that he felt at the time. These were the 1910s. I talked to you about the Silver Age of Russian poetry last month, and Pasternak is not always acknowledged as being part of it. His first poems were published in 1913, but they are not what he's most known for. He first dabbled in symbolism, then switched to futurism. He was completely enamored with Mayakovsky, by the by, but starting from 1920s, Pasternak didn't belong to any particular movement in poetry. After the October Revolution, Pasternak's parents and siblings relocated to Germany. Pasternak and his wife Evgenia Lurie spent some time with them there, but 1923, Pasternak returned to Soviet Union for good. There is some discussion around this decision in particular because Pasternak was not a Bolshevik or a communist for that matter. He was rather ambivalent towards such matters, really. The answer that I saw is that Pasternak saw the state of the first Russian immigration there in Germany, and that state was not prosperous, and he understood mostly that his audience was back in the Soviet Union, so he returned to them. Should we pass judgment on him for it? Maybe. But the Soviet Union of the 1920s was far from the beast that it would become. And moreover, there were promises made to the authors, not just jobs and money, but like influence and powers over the minds of the generation. So a lot of the authors were lured back in, not just Pasternak or Gorky, for instance, but even Alexei Tolstoy, a freaking count, he'd also returned. And that promise actually held for some time. 1920s, 1930s were a time of great success for Pasternak. He was being published, he was very active in the Soviet Writers' Union. Bukharin at one point called him the best poet of the Soviet Union. On the personal side, a little snafu. He fell in love with Zinaida Neuhaus, who was also married at the time, and after a 2-year affair, they finally divorced from their first partners and remarried. But 1930s is when it got dicey for Pasternak. Yes, 1936, he got this house gifted to him by the state in the writer's village called Peredelkino, where he would spend the rest of his life. And yes, that same year he wrote 2 poems praising Stalin, but that relationship with the government and Stalin specifically got slowly chipped away. Some cite him standing up for Akhmatova's husband and son, who were arrested for political reasons. Some talk about the overall changing tides, like literature could no longer be apolitical, it needed to be propagandistic, and Pasternak didn't want to do that. The famous anecdote is when Osip Mandelstam got into hot waters with the government, and that metaphor doesn't really do justice for what happened to him, and Stalin called Pasternak personally to discuss that situation and potentially see where Pasternak stood, and Pasternak simply offered to meet the dictator and talk about meaning of life. Stalin hung up on him. I bring this anecdote up to give you an idea where Pasternak stood politically. His route was conformity for sure, passivity if you will. He maybe didn't see the Soviet experiment as anything great, but also not something really to talk about. He didn't support it openly, as the government expected of all of its citizens, but writers especially, but he also wasn't fighting it openly either. But those incidences with Akhmatov and Mandelstam specifically show a type of personality that is still willing to stand up for what they believe to be the right thing to do, and who is not willing to do what is not right, even if it's socially acceptable. There are other incidences that I'm not going to say much to you unless you're really into the context of it all. Like, for example, Pasternak refusing to participate in a smear campaign against a fellow author. That was actually kind of brave for the time period. In a totalitarian state, the nonconformity in the form of refusal to participate in heinous acts is protest already. We will talk about it more in a second, but Pasternak wasn't a dissident author, but he wasn't a commie either. And so this or that way, the fall from grace started for Pasternak. But ironically, this inability to get his work published led to a different avenue for him to express himself, and arguably the one that he's most famous for. Because Pasternak is not really famous for his poems, that's for poetry nerds, and he's not even known for Doctor Zhivago, that's for academics. No, he is known for his translations. Where is my Shakespeare? Pasternak has done magnificent translations of Shakespeare, of Goethe's Faust, and Schiller's Maria Stuart. I'm mostly showing this because this is a beautiful edition of Shakespeare. I also was looking it up because there are other translations other than Pasternak's, and I was trying to find whose translations is in here, and they only listed the artist in the beginning, and in the after that, it says that it's a Pasternak translation, but like, it's something else, honestly. Let me grab something. Yeah. But basically, his translations of Hamlet, of Romeo and Juliet, they are canonical to us. There are others, obviously, and they do have their merit, but this is canon. And honestly, that's one of the answers as to why Zhivago is not that famous, because we know and love Pasternak for this. These translations were done in the 1930s, 1940s, and they paid fairly well. That allowed him to stay afloat. But 1945, right at the end of World War II, he started working on Doctor Zhivago, and that took him about 10 years to finish. On a personal note, 1946 he met Olga Ivinskaya, who became his mistress and muse for the rest of his life. He passed away in 1960 in Peredelkino from lung cancer. He's buried there in a small village cemetery. He's got a relatively modest gravestone, by the way. Both Chukovsky and Yevtushenko, buried next to him, got way grander displays, if you will. Now, I've omitted the later years of Pasternak's biography there because they are far too interwoven with Dr. Zhivago's story, so let's get to it. As I said, Pasternak started working on Dr. Zhivago in 1945. Well, some of the ideas for it can be traced as far back as the 1920s. Researchers like to weave this tale that all of these people who lived through the Russian Revolution and the Russian Silver Age were gone one way or the other by that point, and Pasternak felt that he had not done as much as they have, especially in documenting that part of their lives. I don't know if it's fully supported anywhere, but Pasternak did believe that this was his magnum opus, if you will, the thing that he really needed to write. Most of the writing period fell on the still 8 years, that's what we call the last years of Stalin's rule, 1945 through 53, but what followed was Khrushchev's thaw, so it wasn't that crazy for Pasternak to believe that he might just get Zhivago published. He started showing it to peers and shopping it around in the late 54 to 55, and it was actually rather coldly received by his peers. Famously, Akhmatova didn't like it one bit and suggested for Pasternak to stick to poetry. And obviously all publishers refused to have it published. But Pasternak obviously didn't want his greatest piece to go gently into that good night. So 1956, Pasternak received an Italian communist by the name of Gian Giacomo Feltrinelli in his home in Peritelkina and gave him a manuscript of Doctor Zhivago to sneak out of the country and have it published in Italy. I'm sorry for mispronouncing the name of Feltrinelli, it's impossible. A famous line is, "I invite you to see my execution," with which Pasternak handed over the manuscript. That's obviously sounds like a callback to an invitation to a beheading by Nabokov, by the way. Pasternak understood that such action would cost him, but maybe he couldn't have really expected the magnitude of what awaited him. Obviously, the Russian political police found out quickly what he'd done. The house was bugged, after all, everyone knew that. So first, there were attempts made to stop that publication in Italy. Pressure was applied both to Pasternak and Feltrinelli. Pasternak was even forced to send a telegram to the Italian asking him to stop the publication, but they'd agreed beforehand that Feltrinelli would only follow instructions if they were received in French, and that telegram was sent in Russian. Feltrinelli was even forced out of the Italian Communist Party, but he still persevered, and he continued on with the Italian translation and publication. Separately, another manuscript was snuck out into France, and the work on the French translation began. In 1957, the first Italian edition of Doctor Zhivago was published, and in 1958, a Russian edition came out in the Netherlands. And the story maybe could have ended here had the Nobel Committee not gotten involved. Pasternak had been considered for a Nobel Prize before, but with Dr. Zhivago sweeping the nations of Europe, that made his nomination very topical in 1958. This is a picture of the night when Pasternak got a call that he'd won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his important achievement both in contemporary lyrical poetry and in the field of the great Russian epic tradition. And that's when all hell broke loose. All researchers call it the smear campaign, harassment campaign against Pasternak here in the Soviet Union. He was instantly kicked out of the Soviet Writers' Union. All authors spoke against him. All politicians spoke against him. Khrushchev did specifically. All papers published not even scathing reviews because nobody could read the novel, but everybody was condemning him for writing such a piece of fiction that was anything but glorifying the October Revolution. A famous quote from the papers of the time period was, "I have not read Pasternak, but I judge him for it." Paper after paper came out with a loud headline condemning Pasternak. Such pressure was applied to Pasternak that he even reached out to the Nobel Committee and refusing the prize, but the Nobel does not work like that. He still has it. His son received it on his behalf years later. But the harassment campaign has gotten so bad that even international players have gotten involved. General Nero spoke specifically to Khrushchev like, "You need to stop." This harassment campaign was unprecedented. Pasternak spent the remaining couple of years in seclusion in Peritelkina, and most speculate that this stress that he'd experienced only accelerated his disease that led to his death. Obviously, the novel was never ever published in the USSR. There is a story about the CIA distributing Russian copies of the novel in hopes of destabilizing the Soviet Union. I don't know if that strategy was particularly effective. The first official publication here in Russia happened in 1988, and that kind of partially answers the question as to why Dr. Zhivago isn't all that popular here. It was too late. The period that Pasternak describes and the problems that he raises were not all that topical in the late 80s, early 90s here in Russia. The country had other things to deal with. It becomes more topical now, by the way. But also the influx of previously censored and banned literature was so great in the 1980s that only cream rose to the top and Dr. Zhivago didn't really make the cut. Part of the problem is also that the novel is a little bit too complex for a casual reader. We'll talk about it in a second. So what was so controversial and subversive about this novel that it warranted such a response from the Soviet state and from the CIA too? Well, not much. Soviet dissident literature has way better examples of protest literature, or even just literature that exposed the dark underbelly of the Soviet state. Anything by Solzhenitsyn, Grossman, even Brodsky, Pasternak and his Zhivago pale in comparison. I've looked at the research and I still have no idea why Pasternak specifically warranted such a response and hatred from the Soviets. Was it the Nobel Prize that was a slap in the face of the communist state? Did they believe Pasternak to be theirs? Does this betrayal cut so deep? I don't know. As I said, Pasternak's political stance was rather mellow, and we will see that in the novel. So reading it now, it feels a little bit toothless on the surface. Yes, there are deeper undercurrents in that novel, but this top layer might just push the casual reader off of this book. I've seen comments that people don't like the main character, that it is too boring, that some of the weaker parts of Pasternak's writing shine a little bit too brightly. And I really cannot blame them. I didn't like the novel myself either, so let's talk about it. I will give you a bare bones recap of the plot of this novel, but it's not going to be comprehensive. That is not possible. The novel centers around Yuri Zhivago, whom we first encounter as a little boy crying at his mother's funeral. His deadbeat father, in a separate scene, jumps off of a train and in his own life, so Zhivago ends up an orphan. He's first taken in by his uncle and then sent off to friends of a family called Gramyka. We jump forward a bit. Zhivago follows in his adopted father's footsteps and studying to become a doctor. He's also following his adopted sister, Tonya, whom he marries. During this section in Moscow, we're introduced to a plethora of characters, like, for example, Zhivago's friend called Gordon, but most importantly to a girl called Larissa, Lara. Lara lives with her mother, who's been patroned by a lawyer called Komarovsky. Komarovsky starts paying special attention to a 16-year-old Lara, and he eventually molests her. She even at one point attempts to shoot him with a pistol in front of the full room of guests, but misses. That's the second time that Zhivago sees her, actually, and he's completely enamored with her. Komarovsky makes the whole situation go away and even allows her to sleep away from him, and she marries her childhood friend called Pavel Antipin, with whom she relocates to a small town Yuryatin in the Urals and has a child called Katya. When Pavel finds out about the nature of the relationship that Lara had with Komarovsky, he has an existential crisis and randomly signs up as a volunteer in the army as the World War I is raging outside. Around the same time, Zhivago in Moscow, on the night of the birth of his first son, is also drafted into military as a doctor. Through a complicated series of events, Zhivago runs into Lara at the front lines as she has become a field nurse to follow Antipin. Antipin is believed to be dead at that moment. The war ends for Russia with the revolution, and so Zhivago makes his way back to impoverished Moscow, where his family is suffering the unfortunate side effects of the revolution, and so he makes the decision to take them to a farm near Yuryatin that Tonya's family used to own. On a rather tedious journey there on a freight train, Zhivago runs into a man called Strelnikov, who is a revolutionary committee leader, who, as we later find out, is actually Antipin. Zhivago and his family make their way to that farm near Yuryatin and start living off the land, but Zhivago gets restless without mental stimulation, so he starts taking trips to Yuryatin to study at the library, where one day he sees Lara again. Passion erupts between them, an affair that lasts about 2 months until Zhivago is so riddled with guilt that he decides to break it off with Lara and confess everything to Tonya, but on the way from Yuryatin he gets captured by the partisans and taken in as their field doctor. 2 years he spends with them, traveling from one Siberian forest to the next, fighting the remaining White Army. After one gruesome execution of prisoners, Zhivago manages to sneak away from the camp and run away from the partisans, and he walks back to Yuryatin, back to Lara. There he finds out that Tonya had his daughter in his absence, and the entire family got the permission to actually leave the Soviet Union for Europe, which they've accepted. Zhivago starts living with Lara as a family, but they feel this constant pressure and constant threat coming because of Zhivago's heritage and also Lara's connection to Strelnikov, who's since fallen from grace. Komarovsky then reappears in their lives and makes them an offer to take them to Siberia first and maybe then potentially to Mongolia, so that Zhivago can reunite with his family in Europe if he so wishes. Zhivago, who knows Lara's history with him, first refuses, but as the situation gets more dire and dire, he tricks Lara to take her daughter and go with Komarovsky with a promise to join them later that he never intends to fulfill. For some time he stays in that farm near Yuryatin, where eventually Strelnikov finds him writing poetry. The two talk about the state of Russia, of themselves and Lara, and in the morning, Strelnikov shoots himself. We jump forward a bit. Zhivago walks back to Moscow, arriving there a shell of a man. He manages to establish some sort of life there. His new friend even publishes some of his poetry, but Zhivago is mostly doing manual labor. He also founds himself a woman called Marina. They have 2 children together, but they are really living in poverty. Until one day Zhivago completely disappears from their lives. He'd actually run into his stepbrother Yevgraf, who promises to get Zhivago back on his feet. But on the first day, when he was supposed to start working at the hospital, Zhivago dies of a heart attack. His body is brought back to the apartment that he used to share with Marina, and that's the same apartment that Lara used to occupy at one point, and that's how, coincidentally, Lara sees his body being brought in as she's come in to relieve the locations of her youth. Over his body, Lara talks to Yevgraf, and he promises to find somebody for her. Lara disappears soon after, never to be seen again, likely captured by the political police and sent off to a hard labor camp. After World War II, Zhivago's friends run into a young woman called Tanya, a woman of terrible fate really, who turns out to be Zhivago and Lara's daughter, the one that Yevgraf promised Lara to find. Yevgraf also manages to get Zhivago's poetry published. The novel ends with Zhivago's poems that kind of build the frame of this novel too. Now, it needs to be said that all I've just told you about is about maybe 30% of the novel, generously. And importantly, the plot is not the point. The committee might have given Pasternak that Nobel for continuing the great epic Russian tradition, whatever that is, but the truth of the matter is that Zhivago has very little to do with the great Russian novels of the 19th century, even if it poses as such. Dr. Zhivago is a modernist novel and needs to be read as such. One of the labels that Pasternak gave to his own novel is my epos, lyrical epos, monologue, a confession even. These somewhat made-up genres frame the novel a little bit better than calling it a traditional prosaic novel. Epos probably fits best, in my opinion, not even from magnitude perspective, although that too, but from the personal journey and how it represents the generation's journey or the country's journey in this particular case. Because Zhivago's story plays out in front of the backdrop of the great historical context, quite turbulent times for Russia. The first failed attempt at the revolution, World War I, the October Revolution, Russian Civil War, and then World War II. And all of these events play out through Zhivago's perspective, thus humanizing them a little bit, because we, as humans, don't empathize that well with groups of people, but we empathize well with individuals, so Pasternak gives us these characters to empathize with. But in contrast to another great Russian epic, War and Peace, where Tolstoy really wanted to depict Napoleon's march on Moscow in great level of detail, as well as the lives of his fictional families, for Pasternak, these events that he describes are only as relevant as they affect his protagonist. That's partially why there are some obvious anachronisms in the novel. Pasternak is not aiming for historical accuracy, and more importantly, this is really the account of his character, and thus it can be wrong. And in the same vein, Pasternak is quite liberal with his plot too. Some of it doesn't make any sense or has any logic to it. And that's because the plot's function in this case is to engage the reader and to serve as a framework for Pasternak to talk about what he really wanted to talk about. And that is faith, Christianity, the meaning of life, man's purpose, and the great historical context. And that's why, and let's start here, the plot is weak. And I'm talking structure, character work, logic. That's probably what most people criticize when they suggest that Pasternak should have stuck with poetry, because prose, even modernist prose, still has some rules to it, and if you break them, the reader is not going to be happy. For example, in the recap, I've intentionally left out about 20 secondary characters and another 50 tertiary characters. Pasternak has no restraint in introducing them. Even bit characters that are going to appear for a scene or two still get a full name, character description, and occupation. Whereas he introduces them all in a quick succession, so on the first read, it's impossible to distinguish the principal players from the secondary characters, and even on the second reread, it felt overwhelming. And I don't think that was Pasternak's intention, so it is an oversight. And that's only because I'm not willing to call it a mistake just yet. For an oldest author, that would have been something that an editor would try to smooth out, is what I'm saying. Building on that, he has these characters constantly run into each other in the weirdest locations possible for no reason whatsoever. Or at least for reasons that high art normally doesn't allow. One similar example from the great Russian classics that comes to mind is again in War and Peace, where Prince Andrei is brought into the same hospital tent as Anatole, and that happenstance serves as a character resolution of their subplot. But Tolstoy tries to make these coincidences not feel so out of place, even though this example in particular pushes it a little bit. Maybe because Tolstoy is constantly aware of where his characters are and what they're doing, Pasternak loses track of his characters like all the time. They just disappear, never to be seen again if he no longer needs them, or they just reappear out of thin air if he needs them once again. And he also uses time jumps to justify these random conversations and random meetings on a train station in the middle of nowhere or in a village on the front lines of World War I. It stinks of melodrama in a way that in that genre, why doesn't always matter, or why can be absurd as long as you bring your two lovebirds together. And it happens here a lot. Time and time again, his characters move from one location to the other, do something together, break apart again, only to meet in a random location once again. That's the entire Zhivago-Lara story arc. These two characters ending up in the same locations just because the author needs them to. And because it's constantly the same characters running into each other, it feels like Zhivago's Russia is occupied by 50 people. Because Zhivago, when he walks back into Moscow, after decades away, he still runs into the same characters there. And don't even get me started on Lara coming back to her old apartment on the same day of Zhivago's death, as his body is brought back into that apartment. There is one example that annoys me personally, is when Zhivago takes his one last tram ride, and the tram is stuck in traffic, and there is a woman that Zhivago sees walking on the sidewalk, and so she constantly either catches up to the tram, or overtakes it, or loses it once again. And then Zhivago dies, and the tram stops, and so the woman finally walks past him, overtaking him, and the author remarks on the metaphor how Zhivago's life ends here while hers continues on. And that woman is a bit character from the beginning, a Madame Fleury or something, who's been dropped from the narrative entirely, only reappearing here to play out that metaphor. So why not have a meaningful character play out that metaphor? And also, for goodness sakes, do not explain the metaphor to me. The novel is complex, but if I've made it this far, I do not need you to spoon-feed me this metaphor, for goodness sake. But imagine that same scene playing out with Lara walking by, or Tonya even, how much more impactful that would have been. But I digress. Unfortunately, the character work is not always there either. Zhivago is fleshed out enough, but even characters like Lara, some of her motivations are clear, some are not, but the secondary characters more often than not feel like props. Like Tonya, for example, Zhivago's first wife, she is a function, not a character. She needs to be this self-sacrificing, suffering woman to present a moral conundrum for the protagonist, but beyond that, there is not much to her. But really, even her reactions to Zhivago cheating and her pushing him towards Lara is not always clear. Why would she do that? We don't know. Or someone like Yves Graf, who appears out of thin air at the end of the novel, only to continue Zhivago's legacy. Who the hell is he? Why is he able to do that? Who knows? Not me. And as far as Zhivago himself, people don't like him all that much. And fair enough, he's not a likable character. Very passive, very inert. We'll talk about why he is that way in a second. And also cheating and polygamy doesn't help. There's also a weird moment for me personally when he gets jealous of Komarovsky, the man who molested Lara, and not of Antipov, whom she constantly tells Zhivago she still loves. Zhivago is a weird dude. The one comparison that I've come up with for him is, imagine if Gone with the Wind was all about Ashley. Also a man from a dying world, clinging to his ideals and struggling to keep his life together, but also unassuming and kind of boring, who's not even able to properly cheat on his wife. At least Zhivago manages to do that. Normally, Zhivago catches the same type of criticism that Wuthering Heights normally gets, so I'm not going to dignify it with a response. If you need to like the protagonist of the novel, then this might not be the book for you. And to be fair, Pasternak is not interrogating the interpersonal psychology of it all, like why would a man cheat on his wife and not feel like it is cheating in a way that we would. He is aiming higher. We're going to mention it a little bit later. One issue, however, that might just be a mistake from Pasternak, a stylistic mistake, that is that Pasternak's characters all talk in the same way, and a very stilted way at that. At times it feels like Pasternak has never had a casual conversation in his life, because there are very few precious dialogues in this novel, but every single time it is characters monologuing at each other. Conversely, that's the same issue that I have with Dostoevsky. His characters are also prone to doing that. It's so full of pathos, so pretentious, such complicated sentence structures and topics, so much exhaustion that it either takes you out of the novel completely, or it lulls you into this different realm where you're no longer reading a novel with a plot, but like either an essay or dissertation on a very complicated topic of nature of man or something. The novel already doesn't feel real, and then characters start talking as if they're delivering a climactic monologue of a stage. And that's a tool that can be used, but it's in every single conversation that they have. Nobody talks like a real person. It's exhausting. The structure of the novel is also not great. It is linear but very episodic, but it also gets interrupted constantly for a lengthy monologue from one of the characters to build these themes, or for a lengthy description of nature. But let me tell you, Pasternak does nature magnificently. That's where the poetry background shines. I never care for the descriptions of nature in prosaic novels, but here they are on another level. I'm not kidding, they are a piece of art. Even when I was getting really frustrated with the book at the end there, because it wouldn't freaking end. But then Pasternak gave me a description of a Russian field and I didn't skip it. I fully enjoyed it. And that's what I meant when I said that Pasternak brings other art forms into his literature. His background in visual art forms shines here, and because there is no other place to mention it, his musical background shows up in his poetry, because the meter that he chose for his poems is very musical too. The plot is very episodic. Pasternak treats it as a series of scenes that make the timeline of Zhivago's life. And some of the pivotal moments get no screen time at all. Like, for example, the entire first affair between Zhivago and Lara happens off screen. We see their first meeting in Uratin and then jump forward to their breaking up point. Plot rarely sticks around anywhere for a long time, changing locations and time settings, and that can be disorienting to a reader. And again, I wouldn't dare call it a mistake, but as close to one as it gets, because the novel poses as a novel with a plot, and plot is rather weak because of this episodic nature. The recommendation is to read this novel as it is, not to look for logic in the plot lines, just read it as it is. The author's intention lies elsewhere. As for the characters, one of the researchers suggested that we treat them not as characters like individuals, but as character types. Like Komarovsky stands in for all of the corrupt businessmen of the old Tsar Russia, or that Madame Fleury stands for all of the intelligentsia that was living in the USSR at the time. And Zhivago himself, he stands in for the entire generation of science intelligentsia. That's why he is a doctor and Lara is a teacher. They are the backbone of that social class. There is a certain temptation to treat Zhivago as the author's avatar, and that is true that he imbued him with a lot of his own personal traits, bits of biography, and, importantly, his poetic genius. But Zhivago does not equal Pasternak. He truly is a character type, representing this whole generation, a doctor-poet. After all, Pasternak is documenting these turbulent times of Russia through a very subjective lens. He tries to process the events that befell his generation and make sense of them, but only from his own perspective. In a way, that's why he chooses Zhivago as a character and why Zhivago is the way that he is. He is a doctor meant to help people, but there is a lot of contemplative in that profession, in diagnosing especially. You need to be observant. And that's what Zhivago does with the history happening around him. He watches, he observes, he tries to understand, but not to interfere or influence. This is some of the tension for the character between what he wants to be doing and doing what's right. In a way, it's a very Hamlet-coded character. Pasternak knew Shakespeare's text intimately, and one of the poems at the end of Doctor Zhivago is also called Hamlet. Zhivago faces a similar conundrum, to be or not to be, to fight or not to fight, to become something he doesn't want to be, or remain true to what he is. And he chooses the path of outward non-resistance. He never fights the events happening around him. First he runs, then he adapts. He allows the tides to take him wherever they need to. This passivity might appear off-putting, especially when the author plays into it in other storylines as well. Like, for example, when Zhivago cannot make his mind up between Lara and Tonya, and then instantly gets kidnapped for a couple of years as to not make that decision. But really what Pasternak is trying to do with Zhivago is show his resilience in the face of the events that he cannot change. He doesn't resist, he doesn't bemoan, he simply adapts and he remains true to himself, but not his wife. We're shown that quite clearly, actually, in the antithesis with Antipov. Antipov, who chooses a different persona, changes everything about himself and denies himself something that he truly wants to have, his wife and his child. While Zhivago simply acts in accordance to his own moral code and chooses to do the things that he really wants to do, that is to spend time with the woman that he loves and also doing the things that he loves, that is medicine and writing poetry. And Antipov at the end there realizes that he's made the wrong choice, that it was all for naught, that the thing that he really wanted, Lara and his child, were within reach, and that understanding actually drives him to end it all for himself. One of the things that drives him to it, there is a complicated web there, but one of the things. Zhivago, on the other hand, in the end, when by most standards he's fallen, he lives in sin with a woman of a lower social class, he's doing manual labor, but at the same time he's still writing poetry, so he hasn't changed on the inside. And in many ways, that's Pasternak's journey, the one he must have believed to be the true one. In the face of the revolution, of the New World Order, of 2 world wars, the only thing that you can be certain of is yourself. So if you can remain true to yourself and your inner principles, then you've done the right thing. You have not become the collaborator or mutineer. You cannot allow these forces to change you and make you into something that you are not. And that's why I think the book is much more relevant for the Russian society now than it was in the late 80s, early 90s. That period in Russian history, for all its faults, was still the time of growth and opportunity. We're in the decay stage now. But the conformity of Zhivago to the events swirling around him ties to the inevitability of them. Weirdly, Pasternak believed that the events of the Russian Revolution were inevitable. We cannot discuss this now, it's a whole separate conversation. The general consensus is that the Tsar Russia, the Imperial Russia, was at its last legs, so something was bound to give, but either change or die. But that specific path to a communist USSR was not certain. For Pasternak, the change was predestined, so Zhivago's decision not to fight it was the correct one. But the plot is thought through and predestined, and the journey end is firmly sealed. I am alone, all drowned in Periseum. Life is not a stroll across the field. And that ties into the theme of fate and God and religion in the novel, as well as the man's place in the world. There are entire sections you will encounter in this novel that are dedicated to it, mostly delivered through Zhivago's uncle. He has a few monologues dedicated to this, trying to understand Christianity, religion, and how our relationship with religion has changed. It needs to be also said that these philosophical sections are delivered with dedication. Pasternak is not questioning. He believes that by the end of his life, he's found the answers, so he's just simply telling us the answers. And that can be off-putting too. I much more prefer when the author is in conversation with me as the reader, rather than just simply giving me the answers. Honestly, I didn't like the book all that much for me to do a deep dive research into the religious themes in this particular novel. I extra don't want to compare Zhivago to Jesus, which is a thing. So I want to bring up a few things for you to think about in your own time and do your own research if you're so inclined. The approach to religion in the early 20th century was very inquisitive. You could question anything and everything. The rules of the church were no longer sacred. I touched on this briefly when I was talking about Gorky's mother, this idea of God building, of creating new God, of building a new one. A lot of it is rooted in the philosophy of Solovyov and his sophiology, and you can see echoes of that in Pasternak too. But the main 2 elements of religiosity and meaning of life and man's purpose in life for Pasternak are art and love. That's what we see in the novel quite clearly. When left to his own devices, Zhivago turns to Lara, who represents this all-consuming, almost like animalistic love that's been sent to them from the above. That's another tie to the fate motif, because Zhivago believes that their love and their union was predestined. And he also writes poetry. These are the 2 things that make him feel alive, and the 2 things that outlive him, making him eternal. The last section of the novel before the poems is dedicated to his and Lara's daughter, who survives against all odds, and to the collection of poems published after his death that give his friends a sense of hope for the better future. And that collection makes Zhivago immortal in the same way that Doctor Zhivago makes Pasternak immortal. Because at the end of the day, the search for the meaning of life, the religion, and all of it is rooted in the fear of death and oblivion that comes with it. So Zhivago and Pasternak both find their immortality in these 25 poems. And that's why this book ends with the 25 poems by Yuri Zhivago. The poems actually came first, and when you read them, you can see that they kind of construct what Dr. Zhivago would become. Many agree that these poems are the best Pasternak has ever written, but Hamlet hits, The Candle does too. So if you don't want to read a lengthy prosaic novel, I cannot blame you, I didn't like it one bit, then you can watch the David Lynn movie and maybe read the poems too. I personally haven't seen the movie, by the way, but all Zhivago scholars praise it, so there's bound to be something good about it. My finishing thought is this. Dr. Zhivago has become more than a book. It's become the symbol of oppression, of harassment, and of resistance. And when a piece of art rises to such a title, the contents often become secondary. In the same way that in the 1950s, regular workers accused Pasternak of betraying their communist ideals from the headlines of newspapers without having ever read the novel, nowadays there are people out there who have not read the novel but still have an opinion on it just based on the meta-narrative that surrounds it. I don't actually have a good answer as to why the Westerners love this book so much. A cursory search in the English-speaking side of the internet hasn't given me a definitive answer, but I at least hope that I've given you an idea of what this book actually is and why maybe we don't treat it as a top 10 from the 20th century. I'll leave you with a fun bit to think about. Vladimir Nabokov famously disliked the novel. Most attribute this hostility to him being overlooked for the Nobel, the one that Pasternak got, and the one that Nabokov coveted. One researcher, however, points out a similarity between Doctor Zhivago, one of Nabokov's novels, and another one by Sholokhov, Quiet Flows the Dawn. And Nabokov's novel in question is actually Lolita. There are superficial but interesting similarities between these three novels, like the corruption and molestation of Lara, Lolita, and Aksinya, and the powerful men that do that to them, and another one that coming in trying to save them. But on a bigger and metaphorical scale, Lara and her fate are often tied to the fate of Russia. That's another layer I didn't get to discuss with you, I'm sorry. But in a similar way, Lolita is tied to the fate of the US. I don't have a good analysis for you here, it's just a little bit of a nugget for you to think about. Honestly, I'm not that happy with the way that this script turned out. I've spent a long time on it and I'm still not happy with it, so I just needed to get it out. The book is complex in a way that I don't particularly enjoy. It also has obvious flaws that didn't make me like it anymore. Weirdly too, there is not a lot of research readily available, like in the infotainment sphere and not in the academic setting. Because normally what I would do is I would listen to a few pop lectures on a book just to get a general sense of what the book is actually about, what people are talking about, and then I can do the deep dive research. On this book, there's almost nothing. And weirdly, on YouTube, in the Russian segment of it, there's not even a good biography of Pasternak. Really weird. So I might have missed some obvious things about this novel, and I apologize for that.